Hi, my name is Ann Haber, and today I will be demonstrating the anatomy of the urinary system. So the urinary system is composed of the kidneys, which actually make the urine. And just to refresh your memory, here we have the aorta and the inferior vena cava. And remember, there were some prominent arteries that came off of the aorta. We had the superior mesenteric artery, we had the inferior mesenteric artery, and these are those gonadal arteries heading down towards the gonads, okay? And then this would be the left renal artery, and then this would be the right renal artery. This would be the left renal vein. This would be the right renal vein. This is the right gonadal vein, and this is the left gonadal vein. Okay, so the kidneys, this is the gross anatomy of the kidneys. They are lateral to these great blood vessels, and they are also retroperitoneal. They have the adrenal gland on top of them. They make the urine, and the urine passes from the kidneys into the left and right ureters. The left and right ureters will carry the urine down to the urinary bladder. This is an anterior view of the urinary bladder, and this is that pubic symphysis that you learned about in Biology 201. And before we take a posterior view of this, I will just point out to you that there's a depression in the medial aspect of each kidney, and that depression is where where you will find the renal arteries and veins and the ureters. And that depression is called the renal hilum or hilus. This is an anterior view of the urinary bladder here. This is the pubic symphysis that you learned about in Biology 201. The left os coxa over here, the right os coxa over here. So this is an anterior view of the urinary bladder, and now we're going to take a posterior view of the urinary bladder. And this happens to be the urinary bladder of a male, and we will discuss these structures when we get to the male reproduction system. But these are the ampullae of the vas deferens. These are the seminal vesicles, and this is the prostate gland in a male. So here we have our ureters emptying into the urinary bladder. I'm going to go ahead and take this off. And then we see that those ureters emptied into the urinary bladder at these openings. These openings are called the urethral orifices or the ureteric orifices. So those are where the ureters empty into the urinary bladder. They are bringing the urine from the kidneys. I'm going to go ahead and unhook our ureters to make this a little bit easier. And let's remember that the bladder is made of smooth muscle, and the name of that smooth muscle is the detrusor muscle. So we saw the urethral orifices, and they are bringing urine to the urinary bladder. The urine is going to exit the urinary bladder through what is known as the internal urethral orifice. And there is an area that's kind of shaped like a triangle. It's called the trigone, and it is formed by the urethral orifices and the internal urethral orifice. And again, that is the trigone. So the bladder empties into the urethra, and the urethra is at this point where the internal urethral orifice is. That orifice is surrounded by a sphincter muscle, and it's called the internal urethral sphincter. It is a smooth muscle sphincter, which means, of course, that it is involuntarily controlled. So the urethra leaves the bladder through the internal urethral orifice, which is controlled by the internal urethral sphincter. So this is a frontal section of a left kidney, and there's our adrenal gland up top, okay? So let's go ahead and talk about this kidney from superficial to deep. So superficially, we see this layer out here, this dark brown layer on this model. So that's called the renal capsule. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue and serves as some nice protection to the kidney. Deep to the renal capsule, we see this lighter colored region, and that is referred to as the renal cortex. Deep to the renal cortex, we have the interior portion of the kidney, which is called the renal medulla. Medulla always means interior. And then we have this part that is not part of the kidney. We call it the collecting system. So we'll talk about the structures associated with the collecting system. So we've got renal capsule, renal cortex, renal medulla, and the collecting system. So notice that we've got these darker structures here that look like triangles, and they're called pyramids. Those are the renal pyramids. And the renal pyramids contain the structures called nephrons that are the workhorses of the kidneys that are making the urine. And we'll talk about the nephrons separately. So these are the renal pyramids. So the tip of the pyramid is here and here and here and here. And those are called renal papillae. Papilla in singular, papillae in plural. Now, as you see, they do kind of look like they have some striations to them. Here's a good looking one where you can see that it's really kind of a chunk of tissue, this renal pyramid, and it does look striated. And those striations are there. They are the nephrons forming those striations. So there's some papillae here, papilla there, there. The tip of the pyramid is always the papilla. In between the pyramids, we see some blood vessels, and this region in between the pyramids are called the renal columns. We'll name these blood vessels in a later video. So the nephrons of the pyramids are making the urine, and the urine is ultimately going to empty into this part of the collecting system. Here, 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 here. Notice how this part of the collecting system surrounds the renal papilla. And these are called minor calyces in plural, calyx in singular. So here's a minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, minor calyx, cradling the renal papilla. The urine will empty out of the renal papilla into the minor calyx, and then minor calyces empty into major calyces. Minor calyces empty into major calyces. And the major calyces empty into this region here, which is called the renal pelvis. Again, this is the collecting area for the urine. And the renal pelvis empties into the ureter. And then the ureter goes off to the urinary bladder. Refresh your memory, this would be the renal artery, this would be the renal vein. But again, we'll take a closer look at these blood vessels of the kidneys in different models. So now we're going to talk about the circulation to the kidneys. The kidneys filter the blood, so we have to have a way to bring blood to the kidneys and to the filtering mechanisms of the kidneys and take blood away from the kidneys. So of course, we are going to enter into the kidneys through the renal artery. The renal artery is going to branch into arteries called segmental arteries. The segmental arteries branch into arteries that go between the papillae, between the pyramids, and those arteries move within those spaces between the pyramids that we call the renal columns. And then you can see that the artery arches over the base of the pyramid. So as that renal artery arches over the base of the pyramid, we call it the arcuate artery. The arcuate arteries give rise to some pretty skinny arteries here that we cannot see very well. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to this model, which is a magnification of a pyramid. So to get you oriented, this is the pyramid in the renal medulla. This is the renal papilla. These are the interlobar arteries, which are found in the renal columns. So the interlobar artery gives rise to the arcuate artery. The arcuate artery gives rise to this very little artery here. Some texts call it the interlobular artery, not the interlobar artery, but the interlobular artery. And some texts call it the cortical radiate artery. The cortical radiate artery gives rise to a small vessel that is actually going to the filtering mechanism of the kidneys. The filtering mechanism of the kidneys is called the glomerulus. We'll take a closer look at the glomerulus later. The glomerulus is surrounded by the Bowman's capsule. Okay, so the artery that goes from the interlobular or from the cortical radiate artery to the glomerulus is called the afferent or afferent arteriole. And there is an artery that moves away from the glomerulus, so it is referred to as the efferent or efferent arteriole. So that's the arterial system of the kidneys. Now, the efferent arterioles are quite a branching network. Ultimately, the efferent arteriole gives rise to a vein. These are like capillary in size, so gives rise to parts of the venule system of the kidneys. So we have venules associated with the nephron that are emptying into the cortical radiate vein, or you could call it the interlobular vein. The interlobular vein empties into the arcuate vein. The arcuate vein empties into the interlobar veins. And unlike in the arterial system, the interlobar veins do not empty into segmental veins like we see in the arterial system. The interlobar veins empty directly into the renal vein. So let me get you oriented on this model. We just talked about the blood vessels of the kidneys. So these would be the arcuate artery and vein. And so anything above the arcuate artery and vein lies in the renal cortex. Anything below the arcuate artery and vein would lie in the renal medulla. So we talked about the interlobular or the cortical radiate artery giving rise to the efferent or efferent arteriole. And that arteriole is making its way to the glomerulus within this renal corpuscle here. The efferent arteriole or efferent arteriole leaves the glomerulus. Okay, so since this is the renal cortex up here, this is called a cortical nephron. This is a cortical nephron. Most of its loop of Henle here, or most of its nephron loop, is in the renal cortex. So this whole thing is a cortical nephron, and these would be the renal corpuscles associated with these nephrons. Now, down here in the renal medulla, we see a nephron that has its nephron loop mostly down here in the renal medulla. So we call that a juxtamedullary nephron. Juxtamedullary nephron. So there's two systems of blood vessels that I want to point out here. The efferent arterioles that leave the glomerulus up here give rise to a system of capillaries that are only seen in these cortical nephrons. That system of capillaries is referred to as the peritubular capillaries. Whereas down here, we see an efferent arteriole. Here's a good example. We see an efferent arteriole giving rise to this system of capillaries here, and that system of capillaries is called the vasa recta. So there is an arterial side of the vasa recta, and there's a venous side of the vasa recta, and notice that that venous blood is emptying into the arcuate vein. So now we're going to zoom in on those afferent and efferent arterioles and the actual filtering mechanism of the kidneys, which is the glomerulus. So remember, the afferent arteriole is bringing blood to this whole system of capillaries. This whole system of capillaries here, some texts will call them the glomerulus, some texts will call them the glomerular capillaries. And these capillaries are actually the filtering mechanism of the kidney. So blood will come here and be filtered through these capillary walls here into this beginning portion of the nephron, and we'll zero in on the nephron in a later video, but blood will be filtered from these capillaries into this beginning portion of the nephron, which is called the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule. So the afferent arteriole brings blood to the glomerulus, and the efferent arteriole takes blood away from the glomerulus, and those will begin to form either those peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta, depending on what kind of a nephron we are in. Okay, let's take a little bit closer look at the some cellular features of the glomerulus and of the afferent arteriole. So the afferent arteriole is lined with some very important cells. We abbreviate them JG cells. They're also called juxtaglomerular cells. Some texts will call them granular cells. Okay, so those have a very important physiological role. And there are also cells on the outside of the glomerular capillaries, and they're called podocytes, and podo means foot, so foot cells. And they also perform a very important function within the filtering mechanism itself. The podocytes form essentially an outer layer of the glomerulus, okay? Now, let's use some terminology that we've used before, okay? So remember when we talked about parietal layers and visceral layers. So, of course, this whole thing is a capsule, okay, surrounding the glomerulus. And we would call this outer part the parietal layer of Bowman's capsule. But there is also a layer formed by those foot cells that goes on the outside of the glomerular capillaries themselves, and they form the visceral layer of the Bowman's capsule. All right, so we have looked at the gross anatomy of the kidney, and we decided that this was the renal capsule, this is the renal cortex, this is the renal medulla, and here we see a renal pyramid within the renal medulla. I'm going to end up focusing in on the renal tubules, which form these striations that you see in the renal pyramid. So from here, let's go ahead and note that we have a nephron here and a nephron here. Ultimately, the urine is being made and passed through these nephrons in the form of what we call filtrate first. And then the filtrate will empty into this tubule that goes all the way down to the renal papilla. And the renal papilla will empty into this minor calyx here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and enlarge this and talk a little bit more about this. So when we talked about the circulation of the kidney, we learned that these were the interlobar arteries and veins. These were the arcuate arteries and veins. These were the cortical radiate arteries and cortical radiate veins. Sometimes they are also called the interlobular arteries and veins. And off of the cortical radiate artery comes an afferent arteriole. And the afferent arteriole ultimately is going to form the glomerulus, and the glomerulus is the filter of the kidneys. Blood that remains in the glomerulus and the particles that were not filtered are going to end up in the efferent arteriole, and the efferent arterioles are going to ultimately loop their way around the nephrons. Sometimes they will become a capillary system called vasa recta, which will loop their way around the nephron loops down here in the renal medulla. So I'm going to talk about the parts of the renal tubules / nephrons. The nephron includes the glomerular capsule, which surrounds the glomerulus, the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending nephron loop, the ascending nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule. Those are considered the parts of the nephron. Now, there are more tubules involved in the renal tubules. The distal convoluted tubule empties into the collecting duct, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct. However, when we get down here towards the renal papilla, there are multiple collecting ducts that will converge to empty into ducts that are called the papillary ducts. And there are about 30 or so papillary ducts per renal papilla. So once we're down here in the renal papilla, we're not in collecting ducts anymore. We're in papillary ducts. And the papillary ducts are going to empty out into this, which is an enlarged version of the minor calyx. So now we're going to enlarge the area that has the glomerulus in it. The glomerulus is a bundle of capillaries that serves as the filter for the blood. So we've now enlarged what we've talked about previously. Here we have the afferent arteriole bringing its blood into the system of capillaries that is the that are the glomerular capillaries. So, and as a whole, we call this the glomerulus. The afferent arteriole comes in, delivers blood to the glomerular capillaries, and then the efferent arteriole leaves and will become the peritubular capillaries or the vasa recta. The glomerulus is surrounded by this very first part of the nephron. And sometimes it's called the glomerular capsule. Sometimes it is called Bowman's capsule. Together, the glomerular capillaries plus the Bowman's capsule is referred to as the renal corpuscle. So the Bowman's capsule has an outer layer called the parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule. And then there is a layer that forms across those glomerular capillaries. And that layer consists of some cells that are called podocytes or foot cells. And that is called the visceral layer of Bowman's capsule, of Bowman's capsule. So the podocytes serve as part of the filtering mechanism. They are a way that we can control, to a certain degree, glomerular filtration rate. So we have the parietal layer, the visceral layer, the glomerular capillaries themselves, and all together, that would be called the renal corpuscle. So the afferent or afferent arteriole, I usually mispronounce it as afferent so that you can hear the A. So the afferent or afferent arteriole is bringing blood to the glomerulus. And it is lined with some very important cells. And those cells are called JG cells, juxtaglomerular cells. They have two important roles. Number one, they contain pressure receptors, baroreceptors, mechanoreceptors, you could call them, that are sensing the pressure of the blood in the afferent arteriole. And they also secrete the enzyme renin, which is very important in a mechanism called renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So those are some important cells that line the afferent arteriole. The blood is filtered through the glomerulus, through the glomerular capillaries, into Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. And at that point, the fluid is now called filtrate. And the fluid will make its way into this very proximal portion of the nephron, and that is called the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, the nephron is then going to continue on, and we'll go ahead and take a closer look at those, the rest of the nephron on a different model. But towards the end of the nephron, we have not the proximal convoluted tubule, but the distal convoluted tubule. So notice that the distal convoluted tubule is situated right in between the afferent and afferent arterioles. Okay, and the distal convoluted tubule, some texts will call this the late ascending nephron loop, but I like to refer to it really as the distal convoluted tubule. It is also lined with cells, and these are also important cells that help to govern the physiology of the nephron. Those are macula densa cells, and they contain osmoreceptors. Those osmoreceptors will sense the concentration of the filtrate, which is here in the nephron. Okay, so they are sensing the concentration of the filtrate, and they can help to govern glomerular filtration rate as well. So this is a magnified version of the nephrons. And just to get you oriented, you've seen all this before, just to get you oriented, these would be the arcuate arteries and veins. These would be the cortical radiate arteries and veins. So therefore, this would be the renal cortex, and this would be the renal medulla. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate the nephron, and then we'll go ahead and zoom in on certain parts so that they're a little bit easier to see. So again, we've seen this before. The cortical radiate artery gives rise to the afferent arterial, afferent arterial, afferent arterial, afferent arterial, which is going towards the renal corpuscle. And remember, right now we're seeing the parietal layer of Bowman's capsule, and we don't see the glomerulus. So the glomerulus is covered up by the parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule. But we have to know that the glomerular capillaries are actually inside the Bowman's capsule. Okay, so the afferent arterial gives rise to the glomerular capillaries, and then the efferent arterial leaves the glomerulus. Okay, and as the efferent arterial is leaving the glomerulus, it forms the system of capillaries referred to as the peritubular capillaries. So here we have renal cortex, and notice that one of these nephrons has all of its nephron loop in the renal cortex. So that's called a cortical nephron. And this nephron over here has almost all of its nephron loop down in the renal medulla. So this is called a juxtamedullary nephron. Okay? And when the efferent arterial leaves the glomerulus of a juxtamedullary nephron, it forms the system of capillaries called the vasa recta. The vasa recta are a system of capillaries that loop their way around this nephron loop that is going all the way down into the renal medulla, all the way down towards the papilla of the pyramid, and all the way down towards those papillary ducts. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at what's happening in the renal cortex, and let's take a closer look at what's happening in the renal medulla. Okay, so once again, we're in the renal cortex here, and these are the cortical radiate arteries giving rise to the afferent arterial, which empties into the glomerulus, which we can't see because it's covered by the parietal layer of glomerular capsule. So the whole thing is called a renal corpuscle. The efferent or efferent arterial leaves the glomerular capillaries and forms a system of capillaries called the peritubular capillaries. And the reason we have this system of capillaries surrounding the nephrons is because we don't just filter things through the glomerulus and then it's one and done. We're actually adding things to the filtrate and taking things away from the filtrate by using these capillaries that surround the nephrons. So the peritubular capillaries ultimately will empty into the cortical radiate veins. The cortical radiate veins will empty into the arcuate veins. The arcuate veins will empty into the interlobar veins, and the interlobar veins will ultimately empty into the renal vein. Okay, so we're actually taking things away from and adding things to the nephron by using this system of capillaries that surrounds the nephron. Okay, so remember the nephron itself consists of a series of tubules. So the glomerulus serves as the filter, and then the fluid that ends up in Bowman's capsule is called filtrate. The filtrate will then pass into the proximal convoluted tubule. So it's always the proximal convoluted tubule that comes off of Bowman's capsule. In this model, the proximal convoluted tubule is always orange. Okay, so proximal convoluted, and it lives up to its name, convoluted. So all this orange stuff is the proximal convoluted tubule. And then the proximal convoluted tubule will empty into the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. So the more modern term is nephron loop. And it has two parts to it. Part of it descends and part of it ascends. Okay, so this part of the nephron loop would be the descending nephron loop, and then this would be the ascending nephron loop, and the ascending nephron loop in real life is a little thicker than the descending nephron loop. The ascending nephron loop will dump into the distal convoluted tubule, which is gray on this model, and the distal convoluted tubule will dump into the collecting duct. Distal convoluted tubule dumps into a collecting duct. Over here on this nephron, we have the proximal convoluted tubule in orange, and then the descending nephron loop, and then the ascending nephron loop, which empties into the distal convoluted tubule. Distal convoluted tubule empties into the collecting duct. So we have lots of collecting ducts up here in the cortical region, but remember, when we get closer to the medulla, or when we get closer to the renal papilla, the collecting ducts are going to empty into papillary ducts. So let's zoom in on that part of the model so we can see that. So here we have a little bit of the renal cortex and a lot of the renal medulla. Okay, this is one of those juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, and so here is the efferent arteriole coming off of the cortical radiate artery, emptying into the glomerulus. Here is the proximal convoluted tubule, all in orange, and the proximal convoluted tubule empties into the descending nephron loop. Now notice, this descending nephron loop of a juxtamedullary nephron goes all the way down to the renal papilla. So this is down where the renal papilla would be. Okay, so and then it turns its corner and it becomes the ascending nephron loop, which empties into the distal convoluted tubule, which empties into the collecting duct. Now, the efferent arteriole of a juxtamedullary nephron forms a system of capillaries called the vasa recta. So the vasa recta is found here, down in the renal medulla, and it has a specialized role in concentrating urine. Okay, so you'll learn about that in your physiology. So here we have collecting ducts making their way down towards the renal papilla. And there are about 30 or so papillary ducts that will empty into the minor calyx. So this would be a papillary duct. And here we would have multiple collecting ducts emptying into one papillary duct. Okay? So remember that when you learn your physiology, we are constantly adding things to and taking away from the nephron. We call that secretion and reabsorption. Okay, so anything that's left over after the secretion and reabsorption are done are going to make their way into the collecting ducts and then finally the papillary duct. And then once that filtrate leaves the papillary duct and empties into the minor calyx, it will be called urine. This concludes the demonstration of the urinary system, which included the kidneys, the ureters, and the urinary bladder, taking a closer look at the anatomy and tissues associated with the urinary bladder and the anatomy and structures associated with the kidneys.